In the winter of 1908, a 2-year-old boy was taken from his mother, carried through the gates of the Forbidden City, and placed on the dragon throne of China. He screamed, he struggled, he had to be held down. His name was Aisin-Gioro Puyi. He was, as of that moment, the Emperor of China, the Son of Heaven, ruler of 400 million people, heir to more than 260 years of Qing Dynasty power. He was also terrified and cold and wanted his nurse. For the Qing Dynasty, the emperor was not simply a political leader. He was the mediator between the divine order and the human world. Every ritual, every prostration, every kneeling court official was an acknowledgement of this cosmic claim. The man on the throne did not need to be capable. He needed to exist. And that requirement, at least, Puyi could meet. He would spend the rest of his life caught between those two versions of himself. The cosmic figure that history demanded, and the ordinary human being that history never bothered to consult. Puyi was born on February 7, 1906, in Beijing, the eldest son of Prince Chun, the younger brother of the reigning Emperor Guangxu. He was, at that point, simply a prince of the Manchu imperial family, one of many, with no particular destiny attached to him. That changed in November of 1908. Empress Dowager Cixi had exercised real power in China for nearly half a century. She was 72 years old and dying. Emperor Guangxu, her nephew, whom she had kept under effective house arrest for 10 years following his attempt to reform the empire against her wishes, fell gravely ill on November 14th. Cixi followed him the next day. Before she died, she made a final decision. The next emperor would be Puyi, a child the court could guide through a regent. His father would serve in that role. The dynasty would have time to stabilize. No one asked Puyi what he thought. On December 2, 1908, a ceremony was held in the Hall of Supreme Harmony. Puyi was carried to the throne by his father, who set him down and bowed. Court officials performed the ritual prostrations. Outside, cannon fire announced the new reign. Inside, the 2-year-old emperor cried and demanded to go home. In a sense, that journey home would take the rest of his life. The Forbidden City is not one building. It is a city within a city. A complex of nearly 1,000 structures spread across 72 hectares in the heart of Beijing, surrounded by walls 10 meters high and a wide moat. At the height of the Qing Dynasty, it housed the imperial family, concubines, eunuchs, servants, scholars, guards, and officials. It was a world complete in itself, governed by its own rituals, its own hierarchy, its own internal logic. Puyi grew up entirely within it. His days were governed by ceremony. He ate alone, served by dozens of attendants who presented dish after dish while remaining on their knees. He was dressed by eunuchs. He studied classical texts with scholars who addressed him as the Son of Heaven and performed the full prostration before him. No one spoke to him as an equal. No one spoke to him as a child. The eunuchs, he would later write, spoiled him and feared him in equal measure. When he misbehaved, they could not discipline him. When he was cruel, as small children with total power sometimes are, they absorbed it. He wrote in his autobiography that he was never truly hungry as a child, yet he never truly ate well either. The imperial kitchen was located so far from the dining hall that food arrived at his table cold. Dozens of dishes were presented at every meal, most of which could not be touched before they were removed according to ritual timing. The ceremony of eating was performed with great precision. The act of eating was almost incidental. Outside the walls, the empire was dissolving. In the years after Puyi's coronation, the Qing dynasty was losing its grip on China one province at a time. Foreign powers had carved out spheres of influence after the wars of the previous century. Reformers and revolutionaries were gaining momentum in the cities and in the military. The old structure, already cracked by the Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion, was approaching its end. On October 10, 1911, the Wuchang Uprising began. It was the spark that ignited what history calls the Xinhai Revolution. Within weeks, province after province declared independence from the king. By December, the dynasty effectively controlled little beyond Beijing. The imperial court debated what to do. Puyi was 5 years old. The negotiations were handled by Yuan Shikai, a powerful military official who served as intermediary between the court and the Republican forces. The terms he secured were called the Articles of Favorable Treatment. Under these terms, the Qing imperial house would peacefully transfer political power to the new Republic of China. In exchange, Puyi would retain his imperial title for life. The imperial household would receive an annual stipend of 4 million taels. The court would continue to reside in the inner court of the Forbidden City. The imperial tombs and temples would be maintained and protected. On February 12, 1912, the Empress Dowager Cixi, acting as regent, signed the abdication edict on behalf of the 6-year-old emperor. The Qing dynasty was over. The Republic of China had begun. Puyi went back to his lessons. He remained in the Forbidden City. This was the strangest part of the arrangement. Not that a dynasty had ended, which dynasties do, but that its last representative continued to live inside the old palace, addressed by the old titles, served by the old rituals, as though the abdication had occurred in some other world that had not yet quite reached the inner court. He was simultaneously the former ruler of the most populous nation on earth, and an ordinary private citizen with no official role. An emperor of nothing, a private person addressed as Your Majesty. He grew up in this ambiguity. Tutors cycled through. Chinese scholars taught him classical poetry and calligraphy. In 1919, a Scottish official named Reginald Johnston arrived to serve as his English language tutor. Johnston was a veteran colonial administrator and a serious student of Chinese history. He was genuinely fond of his student, and the feeling was apparently mutual. Johnston introduced Puyi to Western literature and ideas, and encouraged him to think about the world beyond the Forbidden City's walls. He brought books, introduced Puyi to the technology of cinema by arranging for a film projector to be installed in the palace, and opened windows onto a world that the Forbidden City's walls had always shut out. Johnston later described his pupil as a young man of real intellectual curiosity, being slowly suffocated by the unchanging ceremonies of a court that still acted as though the empire existed. He published his account of these years in 1934 in a memoir titled Twilight in the Forbidden City. Puyi took to the lessons with enthusiasm. He was quick and restless, bored by the slow repetitions of court ritual. He learned English. He read Western books. He wanted spectacles and was told by his tutors that an emperor wearing them was undignified. He got them anyway. He had the threshold bars of the palace gates filed down so he could ride a bicycle through the courtyards without dismounting. In July of 1917, when Puyi was 11, a general named Zhang Xun marched his troops into Beijing and briefly restored the Qing dynasty. Zhang Xun was an ardent royalist. His soldiers were known for keeping their Manchukuos long after the rest of China had cut them off. The restoration lasted exactly 12 days. Republican forces responded with aircraft, dropping bombs over Beijing, the first time the city had ever been attacked from the air. Zhang Xun's forces dissolved. Puyi abdicated a second time. He was 11 years old. In 1922, at 16, the court arranged his marriage. The process was formal. Photographs of candidates were presented. Puyi selected Wan Rong from a prominent Manchu family as his empress. A second woman, Wen Shou, was designated his consort. Neither woman had meaningful say in what was decided. 2 years later, the arrangement that had held since 1912 came to a sudden end. On the morning of November 5th, 1924, Puyi was informed that he had 2 hours to leave the Forbidden City. The order came from Feng Yuxiang, a Republican general who had staged a coup in Beijing. He had decided unilaterally that the Articles of Favorable Treatment were no longer in force. Puyi must leave. he must also surrender his imperial title. In the rushed departure, the imperial household scrambled to move what valuables they could. Puyi was taken to his father's residence. Within days, seeking a degree of protection that Republican-controlled Beijing could not offer, he moved to the Japanese legation quarter. The following year, he moved further to the Japanese concession in the coastal city of Tianjin, an area under Japanese administration and outside Chinese jurisdiction. He would live there for 6 years, occupying a succession of large residences in the concession. First a compound known as Zhongyuan, then from 1929, a quieter estate called Jingyuan, the Garden of Tranquility. Both were comfortable by any measure. Neither was home. His life in Tianjin looked from the outside pleasant. He wore Western suits and drove motor cars. He attended social events, played tennis, and hosted dinners. He carried himself like a man of consequence, but the comfort was conditional. He was stateless. The Qing dynasty was gone. The articles of favorable treatment had been revoked. He existed in a legal limbo that made him entirely dependent on whoever chose to protect him. At this point, that was Japan. Japanese officials visited regularly. The conversations were courteous and increasingly purposeful. They understood what Puyi wanted above all else, a restoration of the Qing dynasty or something approaching it. They could not give him that, but they had other proposals, and he was willing to listen. His home life was deteriorating. Wan Reng, his empress, had no genuine role and no freedom. She had begun using opium. The marriage, never built on warmth, grew distant. In 1931, 2 things happened that would reshape everything. The first was personal. That summer, his consort Wen Shou contacted lawyers and filed for divorce through a Chinese civil court. The case ran in newspapers across China. A former emperor's consort was taking him to court. The divorce was finalized in October. She won. The second was geopolitical. On September 18, 1931, as the divorce proceedings were still underway, Japanese officers of the Kwantung Army staged an explosion on a Japanese-controlled railway line near the city of Mukden. They blamed it on Chinese saboteurs and used it as justification to occupy all of Manchuria. Within months, Japan controlled the entire region. They had a use for Puyi. What happened next is one of the most contested questions in Puyi's story. A new state, the Japanese told him, would be established in Manchuria, the ancestral homeland of the Manchu people. It would be called Manchukuo. Puyi would be its head of state. The precise nature of that role was left deliberately vague in the initial negotiations. How much did he choose? Puyi later claimed, in his autobiography and in testimony before the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, that he was essentially coerced, that Japanese agents gave him no real alternative, that refusing was not a viable option. Japanese documents and the accounts of those around him present a more complicated picture. He was willing. He had wanted a restoration of Qing for as long as he could remember. He told himself that Manchukuo might be the first step towards something larger. He was wrong about what the arrangement would actually mean. On March 1, 1932, the state of Manchukuo was proclaimed. Puyi became its chief executive, a title dressed in imperial ceremony but carrying no real authority. The capital was established at Changchun, which was renamed Xinjing, meaning new capital. On March 1, 1934, he was elevated to Emperor of Manchukuo, with the reign name Hongde. He had a palace. It had been converted from a former salt tax administration building. He had his ceremonies, his robes, his court. He also had, in every meaningful respect, no power. Every significant decision in Manchukuo was made by the Japanese Kwantung Army. Japanese officials occupied the key positions in every ministry. Puyi's decrees required Japanese approval. A Japanese liaison officer assigned to the palace supervised his daily activities. He could not receive foreign visitors, travel beyond the palace grounds, or inspect his own territory without Japanese accompaniment and prior approval. On the occasions when he was taken to tour factories or review troops, the routes were planned in advance, and his movements were supervised throughout. He described the relationship in his autobiography as being like a puppet. It was not a metaphor he used loosely. Wan Rong lived in the palace but was completely isolated. Her dependency on opium, which had begun in Tianjin, deepened severely in these years. By the late 1930s, she was rarely coherent. After the fall of Manchukuo in August 1945, she was captured by Chinese Communist forces in January 1946. She died in their custody in June of that year, in the city of Yanji, in Jilin province. She was 39 years old. In the territory Puyi nominally ruled, Manchukuo was a state built on forced labor, resource extraction, and violent suppression of resistance. A Japanese military unit known as Unit 731, a medical and biological experimentation unit, operated in that territory, which conducted lethal experiments on human beings, operated near Harbin within Manchukuo's borders. Puyi did not control these operations. The historical record does not establish with precision what he knew and what he chose not to know. He reigned for 13 years. On August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Manchuria. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender. Puyi and his court fled the capital, Xinjing. He made his way south toward Shenyang, intending to fly to Japan. He believed that the American occupation forces, who would govern Japan after the surrender, would treat him more leniently than the Chinese communists, who were then fighting the Chinese nationalists for control of the mainland. On August 16th, at Shenyang Airport, Soviet forces took him into custody. The formal abdication of Manchukuo followed, conducted with 43 people present. The 13-year reign of Kang Da was over. Puyi was transported to Soviet territory. He would spend the next 5 years as a prisoner, held first near the city of Chita in Siberia, then near Khabarovsk in the Soviet Far East. He was not held under harsh conditions by the standards of the time. He was housed separately from ordinary prisoners and provided with reasonable food and relative comfort. He still had attendants to manage his personal needs, a residual accommodation that also reflected how completely he remained incapable of managing alone. But he was a prisoner, with no control over his situation, no certainty about his future, and no influence over the negotiations that were deciding what would become of him. In August of 1946, he was brought to Tokyo to testify before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the court established by the Allied powers to try Japanese leaders for war crimes. His testimony stretched over several days. He presented himself as entirely a victim of Japanese coercion, a figurehead who had been installed without genuine choice, who had held no real power, who bore no real responsibility for what was done in Manchukuo under his name. Some of this was true. Much of it was incomplete. Japanese military commanders gave accounts of meetings at which Puyi had participated actively. Documents bearing his seal were introduced as evidence. Prosecutors from several Allied nations challenged parts of his account. The Soviet Union, which controlled him and had its own reasons for placing full responsibility on Japan, supported his version of events. He was not indicted. In July of 1950, the People's Republic of China, established the previous year under Mao Zedong, received him from the Soviets. He was transported to Liaoning province and delivered to the Fushun War Criminals Management Center. He expected to be executed. The facility at Fushun held Japanese war criminals, Chinese nationalist officers, and Manchukuo officials, including many who had served directly under Puyi. Among the Japanese prisoners were officers and administrators who had actually run Manchukuo, men whose decisions had shaped the territory Puyi had nominally presided over for 13 years. Some of them were, in a precise sense, the people who had given him his orders. Now they sat in the same study sessions, ate in the same dining hall, and wrote the same self-criticisms alongside the man who had been their puppet emperor. The communist authorities conceived of the facility as a place of transformation. class enemies could be remade into productive socialist citizens through study, self-criticism, and guided reflection. Whether this was a sincere project or a sophisticated form of psychological control, or some combination of both, is a question historians have not resolved. For Puyi, the early period was disorienting in a way that was almost poignant. He had never, in more than 40 years of life, done anything for himself. Servants had dressed him, bathed him, prepared every meal, managed every physical detail of his existence. In the first weeks at Fushun, he could not button his own coat. He had difficulty using the shared facilities of the prison. He had to be taught, slowly and sometimes with visible embarrassment, the basic tasks of an ordinary adult life. Over months and then years, he learned. He made his bed, he swept his room. He eventually worked in the prison's garden, tending vegetables alongside other prisoners. He attended political study sessions. He wrote self-criticisms. He read Marx, Engels, and Mao. He participated in group discussions with former officials, including the Japanese officers who had managed the occupation he had nominally presided over. Whether the transformation he displayed was genuine, and to what extent his later autobiography reflects his authentic views rather than what was expected of him, is a question the historical record cannot fully answer. The autobiography itself was collaborative. A writer named Li Wanda worked with Puyi over several years to shape the manuscript, and the text was reviewed by prison authorities before publication. Prison officials consistently noted his compliance and apparent sincerity. He came to articulate, in writing and in conversation, an understanding of what the system he had participated in had done to others. Whether he believed what he wrote, or whether he had learned, at last, how to tell the people in authority exactly what they wanted to hear, is something only he could have answered. On December 4, 1959, Puyi received a special pardon. He was 53 years old. He had never, in his entire life, lived as an ordinary citizen. He was given a room in Beijing. He was given a job. For several years following his release, Puyi worked at the Beijing Botanical Garden as an ordinary laborer, tending plants alongside colleagues who were, in official terms, his equals. People who called him by his name, not his title, who ate at the same table, who went home to their families at the end of the day. He took the bus to work and back. He paid for his meals. He stood in queues. These were not metaphors for some larger transformation. They were the literal facts of a daily life that had been entirely unavailable to him for 53 years. By the accounts of those who knew him in this period, he found something close to contentment. He was curious about ordinary existence in ways that were almost touching in their novelty. He was astonished by bus routes and markets, and the texture of daily life in a city he had lived near for decades without ever really seeing. On April 30th, 1962, he married for the fifth and final time. His wife was Li Shushayan, a nurse who was 37 years old at the time of their marriage. He was 56. It was, by most accounts, the most equal and perhaps the warmest relationship of his adult life. He wrote his autobiography. It was published in 1964 under the title My First Half of Life. The English translation was called From Emperor to Citizen. It is a remarkable document, shaped by the requirements of the political moment in which it was produced, but containing beneath the required ideological framing a genuinely human record of a life that passed through more transformations than perhaps any other in the 20th century. He later took a position as a researcher with the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, reviewing historical documents. The Cultural Revolution came in 1966. Red Guards, organized to destroy what the movement called old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits, moved through Beijing with particular intensity. Former emperors and former officials of the old order were targets. Puyi was subjected to public denunciation sessions, made to stand before crowds who shouted accusations at him. He was elderly and ill. Kidney cancer had been diagnosed. The physical and psychological strain was severe. He died on October 17, 1967. He was 61 years old. The Cultural Revolution was then at its height. His death was noted briefly, and then for some years, largely set aside. He was eventually rehabilitated in the official Chinese narrative. In January of 1995, his ashes were moved to a private cemetery near the Western Qing tombs outside Beijing, not far from the mausoleums of his ancestors. Bernardo Bertolucci's film, released in 1987, and the first Western production ever permitted to film inside the Forbidden City, brought his story to audiences around the world. It won 9 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. What remains is the question of what to make of him. He was not a hero, he did not resist, he did not sacrifice himself for anything larger than his own survival, and earlier, his own dynastic ambitions. He collaborated with a regime that caused tremendous suffering, even if his collaboration was partly compelled and his actual power largely fictional. He was also not simply a villain. He was a person who was assigned the most extreme role in the world before he could speak, trained for a world that had already ended before he could understand it, deprived of every ordinary human skill, and moved from ceremony to exile to captivity to re-education and finally to a garden in Beijing by forces that never once paused to ask what he wanted. The Son of Heaven, a gardener. Both things were true, and in both cases he was far more shaped by his circumstances than shaping of them. That perhaps is the most honest thing that can be said about the last emperor of China.